Hi, this is the new specification revision video for the approaches topic. The specification is up behind me. We're going to be looking at the origins of psychology, looking at the basic assumptions of the learning approaches, the cognitive approach and the biological approach. We will also be evaluating all three of those approaches as we go. Right, now with regards to the origins of psychology, in 1875 Wilhelm Wundt was the person who established the first psychology laboratory in Germany. The discipline was moving from its origins in philosophy to experimental psychology when this happened. Introspection is the first key term that you need to be familiar with, and that is the process by which a person gains knowledge about his or her own mental and emotional states. They examine their consciousness, their thoughts, their feelings and their emotions. Wundt would have ensured that this was done in a controlled way, in a controlled environment, in order to be able to analyse those experiences. However, he found that those reports could not be replicated and therefore they were unreliable as they were subjective. So that's what you need to know about introspection. Empiricism is the idea that the only knowledge that humans can have is based on experience. So that is sensory experience in terms of what we see and what we hear. So all knowledge is derived from this sensory experience, and empiricism itself is characterized by the use of the scientific method. Now the scientific method refers to the use of investigative methods that are objective, that are systematic and that are replicable. So those are the three key things there of the scientific method: objective, systematic and replicable. So what happens is you might make an observation and you have a question based on this thing that you have seen. So you do a bit of research, you formulate a hypothesis and you do an experiment, for example, to test that hypothesis. You gain some data and you come up with a conclusion. That is the scientific method. So the testing and modification of hypotheses based on the scientific method. Now the behaviorist approach is the first approach that we're going to look at, and the behaviorist approach is empirical, it's highly scientific, it's based on lab experiments on animals, and it describes how animals learn. That is the key thing. It's about learning from our environment through association and through consequence. So classical conditioning is to do with a learned association between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. Now, Pavlov is famous for his research on classical conditioning, so you will know the experiment Pavlov's dogs, which we will go through very briefly in just a moment. Operant conditioning somewhat differently, so it's not to do with learning by association, it's to do with learning through consequences and possible reinforcement, as well as punishment. So the idea is if you are reinforced positively, so if you're given a treat, for example, for a particular behaviour, you are more likely to repeat that behaviour. However, if you're punished for a behaviour, you are then less likely to repeat that behaviour. Above me is a grid which explains Pavlov's dog's experiment using classical conditioning. So as you can see there, the unconditioned stimulus is food, and that leads to the unconditioned response of salivation. Now that has to be something that is automatic, something that is not controlled. It cannot be controlled. Then the unconditioned stimulus of food is paired with the neutral stimulus of the bell. And that then leads to the unconditioned response of salivation, again. And that these two stimuli are becoming associated. Finally, the conditioned stimulus of just the bell ringing will lead to the conditioned response of salivation. So the neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus. It is very, very, very important for you to learn this diagram because it is applicable to so many areas of the specification. For example, you might use it in attachment when referring to the attachment between an infant and a caregiver, and you might use it in psychopathology as well when thinking about how the behaviorists explain phobias. With regards to the evaluation of the behaviorist approach, there are a number of strengths. Because the experiment took place in a lab, they're highly scientific, they're highly controlled. We try to look for a cause and effect relationship there. the behaviourist approach is also applicable to the real world. So, for example, in our school, if you give in a very good piece of homework, I will give you a sticker. Now, I will give you a sticker for that good piece of homework, but if you don't give me a piece of homework by the deadline, I'll give you a detention. Now, giving you the sticker is positive reinforcement. Giving you the detention is the punishment. Now, negative reinforcement is the bit that students often get confused on. So, doing the homework, not to get the sticker, but doing the homework to avoid the detention would therefore be negative reinforcement. Hence, the behaviourist approach being applicable to the real world. Now, in terms of further applications, the behaviourist approach is also used in therapies for phobias, including things like systematic desensitization and flooding, are based on the behaviourist approach, so that's another strength. Now, weaknesses is that the experiments that were done, so Pavlov's dogs, for example, Skinner's box, for example, the work on the pigeons that Skinner also did, it caused the animals significant harm and suffering. That is unethical. That is unethical, and that is a limitation. However, that can be justified to a certain extent on the basis of the scientific knowledge that we have now gleaned from those studies having taken place. Social learning theory is the next topic. So social learning theory describes how people learn from other people. So it's founded on the work of Albert Bandura, so that's the Bobo doll studies, and we'll be looking at that in a bit more detail in just a second. So it uses the concepts of imitation, identification, modelling, and vicarious reinforcement to explain learning. So imitation is just the copying of behaviour. Modelling is the person who is modelling that behaviour, of course, that is to be then imitated. If you identify with somebody, you are far more likely to copy or imitate their behaviour, so on the grounds of the same race, the same age, the same gender. And vicarious reinforcement is to do with if you see positive or negative outcomes happening for somebody else, then you are going to copy that behaviour. So if you see someone else being punished, you are less likely to copy that behaviour. But if you see someone else being rewarded, you are more likely to copy that behaviour. It also calls on mediational processes, which are mental representations which link observed behaviour and learned action. So that kind of starts to bring in the cognitive stuff a little bit there. Bandura's research. Now, it's key to remember that Bandura did two big pieces of research. The first was in 1961, where he recorded the behaviour of children who watched an adult behave in an aggressive way towards a Bobo doll, hitting it with a hammer, shouting abuse at it, etc. When these children were later observed playing, they behaved more aggressively towards the Bobo doll as well than the children who had originally witnessed non-aggressive behaviour towards the doll. So that obviously shows imitation and modelling. The second key piece of research was done alongside, so it was Bandura and Walters, so it was done alongside Walters. It was in 1963, and this piece of research was different because Bandura and Walters showed videos to the children. The children did not see the aggression towards the Bobo doll happen in front of them. They showed videos to the children. One group of children saw the adult being praised for their aggressive behaviour, the second group saw the adult being punished for their aggressive behaviour, and the third group was the control group, where they saw no consequence. When given their own Bobo doll to play with, the first group obviously showed the most aggression, the third group showed the least aggression, and the second group was in the middle, and that obviously shows us vicarious reinforcement, because the children are then acting in a way that they have seen other people be punished or rewarded for. Social learning theory, SLT, the strength size that is based on laboratory research again, which is obviously very, very good, so we can see a causal link, we can try and establish a causal link between the IV and the DV. Weaknesses are that the social learning theory ignores genetic factors and hormonal factors, for example, and potentially a more holistic account of behaviour could be even better. The cognitive approach explains behaviour through our internal mental processes. Now, internal mental processes are quite simply things like memory or perception, things that we can't see. I can't see you remembering something, I can't see you perceiving something. Additionally, The cognitive approach discusses schemas, which are a mental representation, a mental framework that help you organise and interpret information. They form mental shortcuts for you so that you don't become overwhelmed by sensory information. Now, the cognitive approach uses theoretical models, so the multi-store model of memory, for example, that you will be familiar with, and computers as a metaphor for these theoretical models. Cognitive neuroscience is this new field that has sort of been emerging relatively recently, and it uses advanced brain scanners like PET and fMRI scanners to map cognitive functions down to localized areas of the brain. The strengths of the cognitive approach are that they have a number of applications, for example, cognitive-based therapies in depression. The cognitive approach is now considered very scientific because of the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, and that is certainly seen as a positive development in the field. In terms of weaknesses for the cognitive approach, as you can see here, there is a picture of the multi-store model of memory. Now, these models of memory are oversimplified. They're highly oversimplified. It doesn't take into consideration that humans have emotion, they have motivation, and that is something to consider. The biological approach is the final approach that we're going to be looking at, and the biological approach emphasizes the influence of a person's genes on their behaviour. So this is shown by twin studies and adoption studies, for example, by comparing monozygotic twins to dizygotic twins. So monozygotic being identical twins and dizygotic being non-identical twins. Traits which are contained in a person's genotype, so in their genetic makeup, may or may not always be expressed in their phenotype. So that's their physical characteristics which are then shown. The biological approach explains behaviour in terms of functions of the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Additionally, it explains behaviour through the neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters carry chemical messages from one neuron to another across the synapse. And this influences behaviour. For example, a deficit in serotonin or a reduction in serotonin is associated with depression. Additionally, an increase in levels of dopamine has been associated with schizophrenia. Evolutionary psychologists finally claim that human behaviours have evolved over time, the same way as our bodies, and they are adaptations to our Stone Age environment. The strengths of the biological approach is that it's obviously highly scientific, it relies on laboratory investigations, brain scanning techniques, etc. However, it is important to note that that could cause us to overlook other very important factors, such as factors from the environment or cultural influences that also have an impact on the way that we behave. Additionally, the biological approach has lots of great real-world applications, such as the use of drug therapies and the treatment of depression and OCD and schizophrenia. However, it's also important to note that these drug treatments, such as the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the tricyclics and the benzodiazepines like Valium, while they are very useful, it's important to note that they aren't regarded as a cure. They're often treating just the symptoms. Finally, the weaknesses of the biological approach. Biological researchers must be aware that their research is socially sensitive. It could lead people to blame undesirable behaviour on their genes, and it could, in a sense, discourage personal responsibility. Now, if you look at behaviour like aggression, for example, which I'm sure most of you will end up studying in A2, aggression, you can link to, there is a correlation between increased aggression and increased levels of the hormone testosterone. Now, if you were to make that link, it is quite possible that that would discourage personal responsibility for aggressive behaviour, and that is something to really take into consideration. Finally, the biological approach does not take into consideration or take into account the influence of the environment on behaviour, like I've already touched upon. Now, that is known as the diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model would suggest that behaviour is down to the influences of both biology and your environment, and the biological approach does not address that environmental influence. Similarly, the behaviorist approach, like we said earlier, does not address the influence of biology. Finally, I just want to touch on evolution, so Darwin's theory of natural selection. So any genetically determined behaviour that enhances an individual's chance for survival will continue to future generations. Now, individuals have to compete for those resources, and those who survive that competition will go on to reproduce themselves and have behaviours that are, well, reproductively successful, if you will, and that will then in turn lead to survival, and then that will therefore continue. The final thing that I would like to say is, don't forget to check out the rest of the revision videos for the new 2016 specification of AQA. The Grade Psychology YouTube page currently has videos for research methods, biopsychology, memory and psychopathology, and now, of course, approaches. Also, follow us on Twitter @GraveNewP. Thank you.